Forget James Bond gadgets. During the Cold War, the Soviets were the real masters of sneaky tech. Gifts were bugged, offices were rigged, and even a simple conversation could end up in enemy hands. Welcome to the shadowy world of Soviet spy gadgets. These 5 devices are so clever, they'll leave you questioning everything around you. By the way, I upload videos every week. So, if you enjoy this kind of content, feel free to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you won't miss a thing. Alright, so let's rewind to 1945. World War II had just ended, and everyone was kind of in that awkward, are we cool now? But spoiler alert, we weren't cool. The Cold War kicked off, and things got super sneaky between the US and the Soviet Union. This is where the Great Seal Bug, also known as The Thing, makes its grand debut. And no, it's not a horror movie monster. It's a spy gadget, though kind of monstrous in its own way. So picture this. It's 1945 in Moscow, and the Soviets decide to throw this grand gesture of goodwill. They present a beautifully carved wooden replica of the Great Seal of the United States, you know, the eagle with the shield and stuff, to the US ambassador, W. Averell Harriman. Now, Harriman's probably thinking, wow, this is classy. These guys are really trying to make peace. They were dead wrong. This seal wasn't just a pretty decoration. Inside it was this crazy listening device invented by a Soviet engineer named Leon Theremin. Yep, the same guy who created the theremin, that eerie musical instrument you hear in old sci-fi movies. Genius, right? The device was kind of ahead of its time. It didn't even need batteries or wires. Instead, it worked by bouncing sound waves off a radio frequency beam aimed at it from the outside. Super clever and sneaky. So, the Great Seal hung in the US ambassador's office for 7 years. That's 7 years of Soviet spies eavesdropping on private conversations about American politics, plans, gossip, maybe even what they were having for lunch. Who knows? But here's the kicker. Nobody had a clue. It wasn't until 1952, when some radio technician randomly picked up weird sounds on his equipment, that the Americans were like, wait a second, what's going on here? The bug was discovered, and people were shocked. Like, imagine being the guy who finally opened up that seal and found a spy device inside. You'd probably scream, right? This whole incident became one of the earliest examples of how far the Soviets were willing to go to spy on their enemies. And Harriman? Well, let's just say he probably never looked at a gift the same way again. Alright, so let's fast forward a little to 1953. The Cold War's in full swing, and tensions are thicker than a bowl of Russian borscht. The US Embassy in Moscow is like the epicenter of spy drama. You see, the Soviets weren't just satisfied with one sneaky gadget like The Thing. No, they were cooking up something way creepier. This brings us to the Moscow signal. So, picture this. It's a quiet day at the US Embassy in Moscow, and everything seems normal. But then, some super alert technicians, probably the kind who'd notice if their toast burned unevenly, started picking up strange microwave signals coming from outside the building. And these signals weren't just random static. They were targeted directly at the embassy. Weird, right? The Americans were like, what are they trying to do here? Cook us? Fry our brains? No one really knew what the signals were for, but it totally freaked them out. They called the phenomenon the Moscow signal, which sounds like the title of a suspense novel. But it was all too real. For over 2 decades, these microwave beams were being blasted at the US Embassy. That's 23 years of mystery and paranoia. Some people thought the Soviets were trying to eavesdrop on conversations by vibrating windows or walls. Others were like, maybe they're trying to mess with our health or behavior. I mean, who wouldn't start to worry about getting zapped every day at work? This whole ordeal led the US to launch an investigation called Project Pandora in 1965. And get this, they didn't even tell the embassy staff about it for years. Imagine working there and finding out later that you were basically a guinea pig in a secret science experiment. Under Project Pandora, scientists studied everything from potential health risks to whether the signals could be used to control people's minds. Yeah, it sounds like a sci-fi movie, but people were genuinely worried. By the end of the project in 1970, they didn't find solid proof of mind control, but there were concerns about long-term health effects. Oh, and fun fact, the US even beefed up the embassy building with protective measures, which must have been like wrapping it in a giant tinfoil hat. The microwave attacks finally stopped in 1976, but to this day, people still debate what the Soviets were really up to. Were they spying, testing secret tech, or just trying to give the Americans a lifelong fear of microwaves? We might never know, but one thing's for sure. The Moscow signal became one of the weirdest, most unsettling chapters in Cold War espionage. Now let's talk typewriters. I know, typewriters might not sound like the most exciting topic, but trust me, these things were at the heart of one of the most jaw-dropping Soviet spy operations ever. Let's set the stage. It's the 1970s, and IBM Selectric typewriters are all the rage in American embassies and government offices. You know, the ones with the little spinning ball instead of individual keys? People loved these things because they were faster and smoother than regular typewriters. But, as it turns out, the Soviets loved them too, just for a completely different reason. Now, the Soviets had this genius plan. Instead of sneaking microphones or cameras into US offices, they decided to target the typewriters themselves. They created these tiny devices called radio pickup units. These gadgets were super small and could fit right into the IBM Selectric typewriters without anyone noticing. The RPUs worked by picking up what keys were being typed and transmitting that information to a nearby Soviet receiver. Think about it. Every letter, every memo, every top-secret document typed out on these machines was potentially being intercepted. The Americans had no idea. It was like the Soviets were sitting invisibly in the room, copying down every word. Genius, but also terrifying, right? Fast forward to 1984, when the Americans launched Project Gunman. What was this, you ask? Oh, just a super-secret operation to figure out if the Soviets had bugged their equipment. By this time, the US was growing suspicious about how the Soviets seemed to know a little too much about classified stuff. So, they quietly packed up every single IBM Selectric typewriter from US embassies in Moscow and Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, and shipped them back to the US for inspection. And guess what? They found the bugs. A lot of them. These little RPUs were hidden so well that it took top-level engineers and security experts to even notice them. The discovery was a huge deal. It proved just how far the Soviets were willing to go to gather intel. It also made the Americans realize they'd been unknowingly leaking information for years. Can you imagine how awkward that meeting must have been when someone told the higher-ups? Yeah. So, about those typewriters? Turns out they've been spying on us the whole time. To be honest, this whole operation felt like something straight out of a spy movie. The Soviets probably thought they'd get away with it forever, but nope, the Americans finally caught on. All right, let's hop back to the late 1960s. The Cold War was like a global chess game, with both sides constantly trying to outsmart each other. The Soviets were getting creative, and they figured out something crazy. Here's the deal. When people talk inside a room, their voices create sound waves. Those sound waves don't just bounce around the walls. They actually make the windows vibrate. Now, these vibrations are super tiny, like impossible to see tiny. But to a determined Soviet spy, tiny wasn't a problem. It was an opportunity. So, the Soviets developed something called window resonance devices. The idea was this. Point a laser beam or a focused microwave signal at a window from a distance. The beam would reflect off the vibrating glass and carry back all the sound information from inside the room. A trained operator could then decode those vibrations and turn them back into voices and conversations. Imagine having your top-secret meeting, thinking you're safe, and meanwhile, someone's listening to every word from outside the building. Creepy, right? The cool thing about this method is that it didn't require anyone to sneak inside and plant bugs. The Soviets could sit in a van parked down the street, point a laser at a building, and boom, they were in. It was a spy's dream come true. Now, this wasn't just theory. It was actually used. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, both the Soviets and Americans were playing this game, using laser microphones to spy on embassies, offices, and even hotel rooms. And while the Soviets had a head start, the Americans weren't far behind. Here's a fun fact. This whole listening to windows thing became such a concern that embassies and high-security offices started installing thicker, double-paned glass or using heavy drapes to dampen vibrations. Some places even started blasting white noise into rooms to make the vibrations useless. Imagine working in an office where there's constant static noise just so nobody could hear what you're saying. But here is the real kicker. The Soviets were so confident in their tech that they didn't just use it for spying, they used it for showing off too. During some public displays of their technology, they demonstrated how a laser microphone could pick up a whisper through a closed window. That's like telling the world, hey, we're watching and listening, so don't even try anything. By the 1980s, the Americans and Soviets had both mastered this tech, and it became a cat-and-mouse game of trying to stay one step ahead. Security teams started to think about everything: soundproofing, thicker glass, even where buildings were located. The days of just closing the blinds and hoping for privacy? Long gone. So by the 1970s, the Cold War espionage game was getting crazier by the day. The Soviets were pulling out all the stops to gather intel on the Americans, and they decided to take it up a notch. What better way to spy than to go after something that everyone in an office uses? Typewriters? Yep, we're back to typewriters again, but this time, things get even sneakier. The Soviets came up with a clever scheme. They would infect office equipment, specifically IBM Selectric typewriters, with tiny, undetectable spying devices. But unlike the RPUs we talked about in Part 3, these weren't just about listening to what keys were being typed. This time, the gadgets were even more advanced. The Soviets installed tiny circuits and radio transmitters inside the typewriters themselves. Here's how it worked. As someone typed, the device would record the keystrokes and transmit the data wirelessly to a Soviet receiver. This wasn't just high-tech, it was Bond villain-level genius. The Americans had no idea that every memo, every classified document, and even personal notes were being intercepted. And the Soviets? They were just sitting back, collecting all the juicy intel. This wasn't some small-scale operation either. The Soviets managed to infiltrate embassies, consulates, and other government offices. They did this by tampering with typewriters and other equipment before they even made it to their destinations. For example, typewriters shipped to the US Embassy in Moscow and the consulate in Leningrad were intercepted by the KGB, modified, and then sent on their merry way. Imagine receiving what you think is brand new office equipment, only for it to be a Trojan horse for Soviet spies. Crazy, right? Now, let's fast forward to 1984. By this time, the Americans were starting to get suspicious. They couldn't figure out how the Soviets seemed to know so much about classified US activities. Something didn't add up. So, the NSA launched Project Gunman, a top-secret operation to inspect all the office equipment in US embassies in Moscow and Leningrad. The Americans quietly removed dozens of typewriters and shipped them back to the US for inspection. And guess what? They hit the jackpot. Engineers discovered that several of the typewriters were bugged with sophisticated Soviet devices. The transmitters were so tiny and so well hidden that it took some of the best minds in US intelligence to even figure out how they worked. Imagine the shock when they realized how long this had been going on. Years. The Soviets had been eavesdropping for nearly a decade without getting caught. The discovery was a massive wake-up call for the Americans. Security protocols were overhauled, and paranoia hit an all-time high. From that point on, the US became obsessed with inspecting every piece of equipment entering its embassies. They even started building secure rooms called SCIFs, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facilities, where no electronic devices were allowed. Basically, the Cold War turned into a full-blown tech war. And the Soviets? Well, they probably had a good laugh while it lasted. But after Project Gunman, the jig was up. The Americans weren't going to let something like this happen again. So, there you have it. The Soviets didn't just play the spy game, they rewrote the rulebook. From bugged seals and microwave beams to typewriters that tattled on their owners, the Cold War was a masterclass in espionage. These stories might sound like something out of a spy thriller, but they were very, very real. And honestly, they show just how far people will go when the stakes are sky high. So, until next time, take care.